Hi, welcome to Unit 3 of History of Education. As we get started with this unit, I wanted to take some time to talk a little bit about what it means to be doing historical work as practitioners, what it means to think like historians for those of us that are not social studies teachers or trained historians. And then I also want to talk a little bit about logistics in terms of papers, both your final paper and your unit ending papers, your culminating work. So let's talk first about what it means to be historians. Um, there are a number of reasons why it's important for us as educational practitioners and scholars to think historically about education, even if we're not historians. And I want to take an example of a discussion that occurred in the readings to help illustrate this point. So we read the speech from General Richard Pratt where he laid out his vision for Indian boarding schools. General Pratt was the architect of them in the late 1800s. He had tested out his ideas in St. Augustine, Florida, at the now we call it the Castillo San Marco National Monument, but it was a prison at the time, a war prison, and where there were Kiowa prisoners. And he tested out his pedagogical approaches there on killing the Indian and saving the man. Saying that in quotes because that's the line that he's famous for. It's atrocious, it's awful, and it's what he said, right? It is what he said that justified the creation of these spaces that engaged in cultural genocide for Native children. Okay, so we're reading Richard Pratt, and a couple things that I noticed that happen in the conversation. So, one of the things that I notice is that for some of us, it's hard to put ourselves in historical shoes. Now, putting ourselves in historical shoes or into the place, the time frame, does not in any way justify what Richard Pratt said or what Richard Pratt did or how society responded. Not at all. When we talk about historical empathy, which is the phrase that we use, it does not mean that we're empathizing to justify. So it's a challenging concept because what it means is that we're trying to understand that person, that statement, that event in its time period, not to justify it, not to excuse it, but to understand it in its context. So, as I mentioned in perusal, for example, as people were marveling is not the right word, as people were aghast at Pratt's language and argumentation, one of the things that is important to note in terms of, because a lot of people ask, how would you get people on board with this? How could you convince people that this was okay? How could you see this as better than, right? Like what, how, Those are great questions, and they're very presentist questions. Because remember, Richard Pratt came of age militarily after the Indian Removal Act, where U.S. federal policy was to either move Native Americans or kill them. That was the policy. He came of age, right? He lived through this era of the Civil War, of legalized chattel slavery, of the Reconstruction, and then the Reconstruction being shut down by Jim Crow laws. He lived in an explicitly white supremacist nation. If we know that, we then can look at Richard Pratt's words and see his logic. Not because we're excusing it, not because we're accepting it, but we can see what his logic was. So Richard Pratt's logic was, we don't have to kill Native Americans if we just make them stop being Indian. If we can make them more like white people, we can let them stay alive. We can let them participate in our society. And that's his logic then is like that this is humane, that he was seen as progressive at the time by many people. This isn't to say that there were not critics, resistors, people who knew better morally and ethically. Not at all. All of that existed. But when we're looking at history, it is important to understand the logic of the time period in order to understand how things came to be and how they persist. So Richard Pratt's vision for Indian boarding schools, these places we know are largely, although not entirely, largely experienced as culturally genocidal places. His vision of what he was going to do in these schools was progressive at the time. How did he get people to go along with him? Really, the bigger question is, how did he convince people that the policy did not need to continue to be to kill Native Americans? So when we're interacting with these historical ideas, whether in a primary source like Richard Pratt or in a secondary source, like many of the other things that we look at, we have to separate out our moral, political, social compass today from the logic of the time, not to accept or excuse the logic of the time. Like, I'm going to keep saying that over and over because I don't want to be misunderstood. That is not what I'm saying. But it is important in order to understand how things came to be, what the logic was. And here's why that's important. Another conversation that occurred throughout these pieces in Indian boarding schools, we're seeing connections between the practices in the boarding schools and schools today. There was a conversation around uniforms. There was a conversation around vocational education versus college prep. There was conversation around language practice. And as practitioners of education, many of us are seeing connections. Oh, we have uniforms in schools. Here's what it's like in my school. Oh, language practices. I don't see support for bilingual students. I wonder what happened, right? We're making these connections. That's really important. And part of why we study the history of education is to understand how these practices came to be and to begin to think critically about them. So let's just take the case of, for example, uniforms. Okay, there was a thread, lots of people participating, right? Around, there were uniforms at Chilocco or at Carlisle. I like uniforms at my school, right? Less bullying, more equalizing of students, hides perhaps socioeconomic differences, can focus on learning. There's lots of good reasons to use uniforms. The logic at the time was, by instituting uniforms, we take away Native attire and teach students how to be more white or like white people, because they'll never get to be, right? In the logic of white supremacy, they can get proximate but not equal. So uniforms were explicitly a part of this practice of killing the Indian. Now, if you understand that, then you can take that piece, and even then, right, even with that logic, for uniforms, we can see some of the parallels to arguments that we make today, right, about focusing on learning, about reducing differences. But how does our understanding of, say, uniform policies in public schools, or specifically uniform policies in public schools that primarily serve students of color, and even more specifically, uniform policies in public schools that serve students of color where the faculty are not of the community, say, are perhaps predominantly white, how does understanding the role of uniforms in Indian boarding schools, how does that help us to now have a critical eye on how this practice is used in schools today? It is not to say, again, not to be misunderstood, that is not to say that anyone who advocates for uniforms is engaging in cultural genocide today. No, that is not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is, If we understand how this practice was rooted at the time and seen, and how it might get us to the point that we are today, we might begin to think critically about how uniforms are practiced in our schools, how they're communicated, how we enforce them, what goes along with them, right? If a school has a strict uniform policy and then also has a lot of rules about how students can wear their natural hair, my what's the word? My hackles? My hackle? What? I can't think of the idiom. But right. But my mind is now saying, okay, this is more than a uniform. This is about something else. Or if it's not about something else, I can ask what it is about because I see these parallels and I want to make sure that that logic is not being repeated. Similarly, lots of conversation in Perusall around vocational education, justifiably noting that today people who work in many of the trades make more money than educators, they have more stable careers than people who went to college, et cetera, et cetera. It's a different economy today than it was even 30 years ago, right? Okay, and so their call in the conversation, we need more vocational training, we need more tech ed in schools. Okay, that's great. That's today. How was vocational training used? And can that help us understand how we got to this point where it's not being used? Because what vocational training was used for was to create a docile workforce. It was really explicit in U.S. imperial policy, in Hawaii, in Guam, with Native Americans, in urban schools with immigrant students, that we are training these children for their proscribed social role. They will not have access to the intellectual class, the white-collar class, the upper middle class. They are prescribed into these factory roles, assembly line roles, manual labor, where at the time, particularly if you think about Richard Pratt's era, right, pre-explosion of labor unions, right, where that was, it was a caste. It was a caste of working people, caste, as in like a caste system. If we understand that, and then we see how when public schooling grew, how vocational training and college prep became a tracking system also for racial segregation, we can see how we got to a point of having backlash against vocational training. That vocational training, right, historically and up until the 80s, right, up until the end of the 20th century, its purpose was to slot and sort students into tracked social roles based on the socioeconomic class and the race that they were born into. Today, not offering vocational training can be seen as an inequity. How does understanding the history help us understand today? All of that is a long-winded way of saying, when you engage with these texts and these arguments, yes, I want you making connections to the present day, but we can't, we can be presentist in how we engage with these historical arguments, but we're losing something. We're losing why we study this history, which knowing that it happened is one thing. Understanding the how, the why, and the legacy is why it really matters for us as practitioners. So I encourage you to continue to stay rooted in the texts. That if you make connections to your current contemporary experiences, that's great, and root it in the text. Try not to just, in elementary school language, move on to text and world, text and me connections, right? What is the text saying? And how can I put the text in conversation with other texts in order to make sense of this historical period, this historical question, or this historical legacy? Okay, the other thing that I want to remind you of is that you should be thinking about your final paper, and you should be thinking about what you want to focus on, which format you want to use, and you should start getting those wheels in motion. In Unit 4, we're going to do a final paper check-in. So at that point, you have one more unit before I'm going to say, okay, where are you? What have you chosen? What resources do you look at? But you should start thinking about that now. What do you want to do for your final paper? And then the last thing that I wanted to remind you of is on your culminating work in units, please, I do annotations right in D2L, the document in D2L, and you should be able to see them there. So please take a look at your papers, the comments that I put in them. I leave comments. I leave a summative comment, but then I also leave comments in text to give you some feedback. Take a look at the rubric too, to see what kind of thinking you want to engage with. Remember, these are culminating work of what we're reading in each unit, what we're studying. And really think of them as your chance to synthesize for me, to show me what you've learned and how you've learned it from this set of readings. Okay, I think that's it for now. I will see you in Unit 3. Good luck.